From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
So the big takeaway for me under Trump has been, if you are going to massively expand the numbers of people who are deportable, and you are not going to afford them the conventional due process that we have written into the law and that we have agreed to in the international law as well, there are going to be real consequences. The consequences have been death, or the consequences have been sexual assault or kidnapping.
When deportation is a death sentence. As the battle over protecting dreamers continues in Washington, we look at a stunning new piece in the New Yorker magazine about how hundreds of thousands of immigrants in the U.S. may face violence and murder in their home countries. What happens when they're forced to return? We'll speak to Sarah Stillman of the New Yorker. Then, as Dodge Ram uses the words of Martin Luther King to sell trucks in a Super Bowl ad, we'll look at the whitewashing of civil rights history.
To reduce Dr. King's message to a ploy to peddle trucks, I think is appalling. I think that to pimp Dr. King's message in that regard, in this day and age, under the circumstances that exist, given what we're up against as a people and where we look like we might be headed as a nation, is absolutely despicable.
We'll speak to sociologist and civil rights activist Dr. Harry Edwards and historian Jean Theoharis, author of the new book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Global markets are tumbling this morning across Asia and Europe after the U.S. stock market went into free fall Monday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged by nearly 1,600 points in the middle of the day, marking the biggest point decline in financial history. The U.S. market then rallied slightly, but at the closing bell, the Dow Jones was still down by an historic 1,175 points. While Monday's plunge was alarming on Wall Street, many financial experts say the drop had been expected after the Dow surged over the last year. On Monday, President Trump avoided mentioning the historic stock market drop, even as he tried to boast about the benefits of his tax overhaul while speaking to workers at Schaeffer Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio. During his speech, Trump also attacked Democratic lawmakers who did not applaud him during the State of the Union last week, calling them un-American and treasonous.
They were like death and un-American. Un-American. Somebody said treasonous. I mean, yeah, I guess why not? You know, can we call that treason? Why not?
The House Intelligence Committee has voted to declassify a Democratic memo that refutes the arguments of the controversial, now-released memo of Committee Chair Devin Nunes. The Nunes memo purports to show the FBI and Justice Department abused their authority by placing Trump campaign advisor Carter Page under surveillance in 2016 over his ties to Russia. President Trump supported its release despite the objections of the Justice Department and FBI. President Trump will now have 5 days to decide whether to try to block the release of its counter-memo written by California Congressmember Adam Schiff, the highest-ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. In Syria, bombing continues against the rebel-held district of eastern Ghouta outside the capital Damascus and against the rebel-held northern province of Idlib. War monitors say airstrikes are carried out by the Syrian and Russian governments have killed nearly 24 people in eastern Ghouta and another 18 civilians in Idlib, where local journalists say a hospital and residential areas have been targeted. Activists also say 9 people were injured in a suspected chlorine gas attack on the town of Sarakeb on Sunday night, the second alleged chemical weapons attack in the last 2 weeks. In London, a judge is slated to rule today on whether to drop the British arrest warrant for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who's been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for more than 5 years. The British arrest warrant for jumping bail is related to a Swedish sexual assault investigation against Assange, which has since been dropped. But even if the judge drops the British arrest warrant, WikiLeaks warns Assange could face life in prison in the United States on charges of espionage, conspiracy, and theft related to WikiLeaks' publishing of secret U.S. government cables. In Ecuador, voters have decided to reinstate presidential term limits during a national referendum Sunday. The result is a blow to former President Rafael Correa, who had been expected to run for a fourth term in the upcoming 2021 elections. The Israeli government has launched a mass deportation plan aimed at expelling up to 40,000 African asylum seekers from Israel. Most of the refugees are from Eritrea or Sudan and fleeing war or persecution, although Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has branded them infiltrators. On Sunday, the Israeli government began distributing notices warning they'd be jailed if they don't leave within 2 months. These are 3 refugees from Eritrea who received the notices.
If I do not return to Rwanda or to Eritrea within 60 days, they'll take me forcefully to prison.
I will choose. It's not a choice, but I will force her to be in prison if they decide, because at least I will stay alive in the prison.
Those countries are not secure for me. I came here to save my life. So what I choose now is to stay in prison.
Back in the United States, in Colorado, the husband of immigrant rights activist Ingrid Quincelada-Latorre has been released from detention after he was arrested by immigration and customs enforcement agencies in what many saw as a targeted attack against the immigrant rights movement. Eliseo Gerardo Fernandez posted $2,500 bond on Monday and walked free from the for-profit Geo Group ICE detention center in Aurora, where he'd been detained since January 11th. His wife, Ingrid Latorre, is an outspoken activist who's claimed sanctuary in a Colorado church to avoid her own deportation to Peru. Meanwhile, in Kansas, a chemistry professor named Syed Jamal is fighting his deportation after immigration and customs enforcement agents arrested him on his front lawn 2 weeks ago as he was getting his children ready for school. Jamal has lived in the United States for more than 30 years after arriving from Bangladesh on a student visa. In Michigan, USA Gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar has sentenced to another 40 to 125 years in prison for criminal sexual conduct toward underage girls in the latest of a series of trials about his decades-long abuse. Dr. Nassar has already been sentenced to up to 125 years in prison in a previous sexual assault trial. He has now been accused by at least 265 women and girls of sexually abusing them, often under the guise of providing medical treatment. The U.S. Supreme Court has refused to block the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's ruling that the state's congressional map unconstitutionally favors Republicans and must be redrawn. Monday's ruling now means Pennsylvania lawmakers must redraw the state's 18 House districts, a move that is widely expected to benefit Democrats during the 2018 midterm elections. And a number of NFL players on the Philadelphia Eagles say they will not visit the White House for the traditional Super Bowl victory celebration. Among the players boycotting the visit as a protest against President Trump are Malcolm Jenkins and Torrey Smith, as well as Chris Long, who also refused to visit the White House last year when he played for the New England Patriots, who had won the Super Bowl then. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. On Capitol Hill, Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Chris Coons have introduced a bipartisan bill aimed to protect undocumented immigrants who came to the United States as children. The future of the nearly 800,000 Dreamers has been at the center of a major political battle in Washington. But on Monday, President Trump took to Twitter to criticize the bipartisan bill soon after it was introduced. Trump wrote, quote, "Any deal on DACA that does not include strong border security and the desperately needed wall is a total waste of time. March 5th is rapidly approaching, and the Dems seem not to care about DACA. Make a deal," unquote. This comes as immigrant rights activists are preparing to hold a protest in Washington Wednesday to push for a clean DREAM Act to be passed before Thursday, when the government faces another possible shutdown.
Well, as the battle over the Dreamers heats up in Washington, D.C., we look at a stunning new piece in the New Yorker magazine, headlined, "When Deportation is a Death Sentence." It looks at how an unknown number of men and women have been killed in their home countries after being deported or turned away by the United States. The article looks in part at a Mexican-born woman named Laura. Despite living her whole adult life in Texas, she was deported to Mexico after a traffic stop. She warned a U.S. Border Patrol agent, "When I'm found dead, it will be on your conscience." Within a week of her deportation, she was murdered by her ex-husband. We're joined now by the award-winning journalist and New Yorker staff writer Sarah Stillman, also director of the Global Migration Project at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me here.
This is such a significant piece. It seems, though, that the government should be collecting this data, not you and a group of students at the Columbia Journalism School, about what happens to immigrants who are deported. But start off where you started in the piece, with Laura's story.
Right. So I wrote about this young woman, Laura, who had been living in the U.S., as you mentioned, most of her adult life. She's driving home from work one night, and she's pulled over by a traffic cop. And at the time, it was relatively unroutine for a cop to actually ask about her immigration status, but that's what he did. And he chose to turn her over to Border Patrol.
In the middle of the night.
Exactly. This was in the middle of the night. And so no lawyers' offices are open at that hour. She's driven with some friends while crying and pleading and saying, "Look, I have this really violent husband back in Mexico. He's threatened to kill me if I'm sent back. Please just give me some time to show you my protective order, to show you why I should stay here." And instead, she was quickly turned over to Border Patrol, quickly then, while continuing to cry and plead, taken to the border and sent right back across the bridge after being coerced into signing some voluntary paperwork.
And she spent most of her life here in the U.S. Can you talk about her life here?
Exactly. So she had U.S. citizen children, and she'd grown up in Mexico, but in her adulthood had been living in Texas, in a community with many other people who were undocumented and who, at the time, didn't tend to worry that traffic stops would lead to their deportation to harm. But I think that's becoming more and more typical in recent months. But this was under the Obama administration that this occurred.
Now, clearly, the Mexican government doesn't do any tracking of the people that are repatriated from the United States. Is there any attempt, even within Mexico, to do a more comprehensive look about what's happening to the folks deported?
Yeah, I think we really see it piecemeal. We've seen some human rights workers and some scholars who try to document this. It's extraordinarily hard because, as you can imagine, when people are sent back, it's quite hard to track what becomes of them, partly because families are so afraid when something does happen, that the fear of retaliation often means that we don't hear about the awful things that happen to people post-deportation.
As you point out, the Trump administration has formed a new office called Voice. Explain what that is.
So initially, when Trump came into office, he expounded quite a bit on what he perceives as immigrant criminality. And one of the things he said he would do is create a special office for the victims of crimes committed by immigrants. He did not square that with the data that tells us that immigrants actually do not commit more crime than U.S.-born individuals. And in fact, the opposite has been proven true in most scholarship on this issue. So this database was essentially going to also log all the different immigrant crimes that had been committed. And so part of what I thought about with my Columbia team at the journalism school was, in some respects, we were building a shadow database to that. We were building a database that showed the many, many people, both under Obama and under Trump, who had been deported and then either killed or sexually assaulted or subject to other kinds of harm.
Well, as you note in your article, the United States obviously has a long history of providing sanctuary for those seeking to avoid danger or killing in their home countries. What are Customs Border Patrol agents supposed to do if a person claims that they fear possible persecution, and what are they actually doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think a lot of people don't realize that in both international law and domestic law, a fundamental U.S. value has been that we have guaranteed post-World War II that we will never again make the mistake of deporting people to their deaths when they come to us seeking sanctuary. That was created out of World War II in part because we sent many people back amidst the Holocaust who had fled Nazi Germany. And so what we're seeing at the border today, and what many human rights groups have been documenting, is that Border Patrol's job is essentially, when someone arrives at the border, they're supposed to ask them a set of questions, which includes, do you fear for your life if you are sent back? And if the person says, yes, I do, it is not their job to adjudicate that or to try to figure out whether they think it's credible. Their job is simply to pass someone along to a trained asylum officer. We have people who are very well trained in the next stage of vetting, and people often get to go before an immigration judge. What we're finding is that in upwards of 50% of cases, often Border Patrol isn't even asking that initial required question. And sometimes I spoke to many women who said that they had answered in the affirmative, had said very clearly they did fear for their lives, and nonetheless the Border Patrol paperwork was marked that they did not.
So in the case of Laura, following on this questioning at the border, when she's handed over to Border Patrol and she says to the agent, when I am dead, it will be on your conscience, what was it his obligation to do?
Well, this is currently being disputed in the courts because there has been a lawsuit on her behalf after she was, in fact, killed when sent back. But ideally, someone in her situation would get to go before an immigration judge. And, that historically, that was the case, that for a long time, people in the United States, when they did articulate these fears, if they articulated them immediately at the border, they would go to an asylum officer, and then they would get to go before an immigration judge. Increasingly, we're seeing that the vast majority of deportations are what's known as summary deportations, so people who are very quickly turned around directly at the border and never given a chance to see a judge. Or in the case of someone like Laura, who had lived in the country for a very long time, in that case, you would certainly be entitled to a judge.
So what have you and your students found?
There's been quite a few patterns that we've seen in this database. One of them is just how often people like Laura get rounded up in pretty minor offenses. So people who had traffic violations, people who had minor workplace disputes that actually led to very high stakes repercussions, so being deported and then killed. We've also seen a real pattern of women who had fled gender-based violence, who in fact had explicit documentation of the men who had harmed them in the past, and then they came here seeking to escape from that, and instead were sent back to the very same men who had harmed them. And of course, we're seeing an uptick under Trump in the number of people who are rounded up in the interior of the country. So previously, we'd focused mostly on people who were turned back at the border. But increasingly, we're seeing people like Laura who had very deep roots here, who had lived here for a long time, who had U.S. citizen children who were sent back.
I mean, Laura, the cop who arrested Laura, ended up going to jail himself. Is that right? He said she was wavering on the road or
exactly.
something?
He said she'd been driving between two lanes. And who knows? I mean, that's certainly possible, but it didn't tend to be the case, as I mentioned earlier, that people in that circumstance would be deported, whereas now we're seeing legislation in Texas known as SB 4 that may soon be replicated elsewhere in the country that says law enforcement, in fact, has to ask these questions. And in fact, law enforcement can be prosecuted criminally if they do not turn people over for immigration enforcement purposes. So that's a huge transformation of law enforcement that many cops that I spoke to were worried about.
Well, that's what I want to ask you in her case in particular, because it's one thing, a catch and release situation right at the border, but if she was already here in the country, wasn't there a requirement, a minimal requirement for her to go through some immigration process? A lot of times people voluntarily agree to be deported to not be detained and put in an ICE jail, but was she never offered the opportunity to try to adjudicate her case?
Yeah, I think that's a critical distinction, right? We have different entitlements for people who have been here for a long time. And in her case, her signature appeared on the form that was a voluntary removal form. So that's what's currently being disputed in the courts, is that, can this be accurately described as a voluntary removal when, in fact, she was pleading and crying and protesting? Border Patrol says that she voluntarily signed and was sent back as a result of that. And her friend who was there at the scene says that, in fact, she had been desperate not to sign the paperwork. So that's the mystery at the heart of the case, and that was what a judge argued made her family not able to proceed with the case. So we'll see what happens in court.
Sarah Stillman, you mentioned SB 4, known as a Show Me Your Papers bill, in Texas. Explain what that does.
Well, SB 4 will do a number of things, and right now it's currently also tied up in litigation. But one of the things is, as I mentioned regarding local cops, that they are supposed to now ask people about their immigration status. It also means that there's this sort of crackdown that Trump has also called for in regard to what he and some others know as sanctuary cities, so places where they have decided not to turn people over to immigration enforcement once they're held in local jails. So one of the other patterns we saw in the database was that there were some people who came into the criminal justice system through minor offenses, like one man, Juan Coronilla Guerrero, that I wrote about. He had come to the courthouse for a minor misdemeanor case, and then ICE had actually appeared in the courthouse, apprehended him, and then he'd been deported despite claiming that he believed he would be killed if sent back to Mexico, and he was also murdered. And this was more recently, and that crackdown had been explicitly, many believe, retaliation for the fact that Travis County, Texas was a sanctuary city.
I wanted to ask you about President Trump's recent remarks at his State of the Union, where he was actually talking about the MS-13 and the increasing dangers from undocumented immigrants to the general American population, criminal gangs. Were you able to hear that? I don't know if we have the clip available of his that part of his speech, but could you?
I think we have a clip.
Oh, we do. All right. Let's see. Let's hear it.
For decades, open borders have allowed drugs and gangs to pour into our most vulnerable communities. They've allowed millions of low-wage workers to compete for jobs and wages against the poorest Americans. Most tragically, they have caused the loss of many innocent lives.
Could you respond to the president's framing of the issue of why it's necessary to deal with immigration?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's absolutely necessary to treat MS-13 seriously, and that's part of the paradox of how Trump has reckoned with this, is that simultaneously he's saying it's okay to revoke temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of people from El Salvador and send them back to this country that is really grappling with a very real MS-13 crisis. And he's saying, oh, it's perfectly fine and safe to send them there, despite the fact that, you know, MS-13 may actually pose a really serious threat to those people. And he's saying those people don't deserve protection here, but then he's also seems to really be intent upon sort of acting as if MS-13's crisis here has a gravity that I think empirically we could say doesn't necessarily compare to a lot of other threats that we could be focused on. But I think we should take it seriously, and I think we should also be realistic about the fact that immigrants do not pose a disproportionate threat when it comes to crime. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, the opposite has been proven to be the case.
Sarah, can you talk more about gender-based violence?
Absolutely. I mean, that was a big theme that we were seeing. And going back to the realities of needing to reckon with MS-13, I think one of the things that we heard from quite a number of young women is that they were being recruited by gang members in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, who were basically telling them, if you don't become my sexual partner, then you will be killed. And, you know, I interviewed several women who had come. One woman who comes to mind, this woman, Elena, she had actually come here after her brother was murdered for being gay. Another brother was murdered for refusing to join the gangs. And then she herself was subject to sexual coercion by a gang member. And when she came here, she was turned away by Border Patrol. She protested, and then she went before an immigration judge. And one of the really big issues we don't talk about much is that women who are fleeing those kinds of circumstances, who even do get a chance to go before a judge, often are told that they don't qualify for asylum or other kinds of legal relief. Because our asylum system was crafted post-World War II, often the concerns that it was crafted around don't reflect the current reality of gang violence and gender-based violence.
And of course, a lot of this gang violence is the historical roots of it is not really ever discussed here in the United States. I remember back in 1992 covering the Los Angeles riots after Rodney King, and the Chicano community the longtime Mexican-American community was very upset about the rise of MS-13 back then. We're talking 25 years ago, and they saw it rooted in a spillover of the Central American Civil Wars and the U.S. intervention, that it was the original MS-13 gang members were actually former National Guardsmen from Salvador who had moved here to the United States, and there was a culture of violence that had actually spilled over from Salvador and Guatemala into the Western United States, and they saw it as a direct result of U.S. intervention. But that's never talked about these days.
Yeah, I think you can't talk about what's happening right now without talking about that exact history you just pointed to, both the history of the Central America Wars and the U.S. involvement in them, then also the history of this set of cycles around deportation, the idea that many of these gangs started on the U.S. side and in U.S. prisons and on U.S. streets, and then were deported back without a real plan about how that would be dealt with. And then we've seen this cycle before, and so we need to look at how do we address those root causes, I would argue.
Laura's mother ultimately ended up working with Jennifer Horbury, well-known for her work around Guatemala and the U.S.-backed, sadly, slaughter in Guatemala. Can you talk about that relationship?
Yes, Jennifer Harbury is a really fascinating person who's had a pretty remarkable life, and she was married to a man from Guatemala who actually had been, that had led to litigation that Jennifer had been a part of after her husband disappeared. She had staged a hunger strike. This was quite some time ago in the midst of those wars. She later found that there was U.S. involvement in a cover-up about her husband's murder and torture and pretty violent circumstances. And so she was certainly a vehicle through which to tell the story of the U.S. involvement back in the 80s and how that stretched all the way up into repercussions in the present day.
Well, you spoke about history, and let's end there. Turning to a clip from the 1976 film Voyage of the Damned, the film based on the true story of the 1939 voyage of the MS Mississippi, which sailed for Havana from Hamburg, Germany, carrying over 900 Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis. The Cuban government refused entry to the passengers, so the ship made its way to the U.S., where the Coast Guard delivered the following message as portrayed in this clip from the film.
Attention, Captain St. Louis. You are violating U.S. territorial limits. Do not approach any closer. Do not attempt to land. You will not, repeat not, be permitted to dock at any United States port. Acknowledge.
Signal. Message received and acknowledged.
A clip from the 1976 film Voyage of the Damned. The ship was left with no choice but to return to Europe. And talk about what happened, Sarah.
Right, so these people had come here fleeing Nazi Germany, and in fact, they were turned back, and I believe it was upwards of 250 of those individuals who were turned back were ultimately found to have been killed in the Holocaust. I didn't know until researching this story that others, such as Anne Frank, her father had actually applied to get the family refugee status here, and they had also been rejected. And of course, she later died in the concentration camps as well.
So you and your students are continuing to search for what happens to deportees?
Absolutely. So we hope to continue searching in the Trump era and finding, again, I mentioned the Obama era had many of these deaths as well, so we should acknowledge that. But I think we hope to continue this process of logging these deaths in the Trump administration.
Sarah Stillman, staff writer at The New Yorker, also the director of the Global Migration Project at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. We'll link to her new piece. It's headlined, "When Deportation is a Death Sentence." This is Democracy Now! Stay with us.
Watching my reflection through your eyes, see my love and giving you the credit for the last time. Funny how you think you changed my life. You think that I belong to you. Tripping on the power I supplied. Thought I needed you a bit, just a little bit longer. Any good you done, I paid the price. No, I don't belong to you. I'm faded, I'm faded, I'm faded. Got too high, I'm illuminated. And I never felt so amazing. You don't know me like you think you own me.
I Don't Belong to You by Pharaoh. Here on Democracy Now!, I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, Super Bowl Sunday marked the 50th anniversary of the Drum Major Instinct, a historic sermon that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. gave at the Ebenezer Baptist Church on February 4th, 1968, 2 months before his assassination. The sermon is mostly remembered for the way King concluded it by imagining his own funeral, downplaying his famous achievements, and saying, quote, "If you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice."
Well, on Sunday, on that 50th anniversary of the speech, Ram Trucks marked the anniversary by using part of it in a Super Bowl ad to sell trucks. The ad featured King's voice played over video showing U.S. Marines, ranchers, and a soldier wearing camouflage.
Want to be important? Wonderful. If you want to be recognized, wonderful. If you want to be great, wonderful. But recognize that he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. That's a new definition of greatness. By giving that definition of greatness, it means that everybody can be great. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know the theory of relativity to serve. by love.
Well, in that same speech that Ram used for a truck ad, Dr. Martin Luther King warned the drum major instinct is a desire to be important and seek recognition, which advertisers take advantage of.
The presence of this instinct explains why we are so often taken by advertisers. You know, those gentlemen of massive verbal persuasion. And they have a way of saying things to you that kind of gets you in the bind. In order to be a man of distinction, you must drink this whiskey. In order to make your neighbors envious, you must drive this type of car. In order to be lovely to love, you must wear this kind of lipstick or this kind of perfume. And you know, before you know it, you're just buying that stuff. That's the way the advertisers do it. It often causes us to live above our means. It's nothing but the drum major instinct. You ever see people buy cars that they can't even begin to buy in terms of their income? You've seen people riding around in Cadillacs and Chryslers who don't earn enough to have a good T Model Ford. But it feeds a repressed ego.
So that was Dr. Martin Luther King giving his speech 50 years ago on February 4th, 1968. Well, Juan Gonzalez and I talked to Professor Harry Edwards Monday on the show, and then we did a post-show interview about the appropriation of King's words. Dr. Edwards is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, author of several books, including The Revolt of the Black Athlete, reissued last year for its 50th anniversary edition. He was one of the architects of the 1968 Olympic Project for Human Rights, you know, the famous image in 1968 in Mexico City of Tommy Smith and John Carlos with their hands up in the Black Power salute at the Olympics. He's a longtime staff consultant with the San Francisco 49ers. I started by asking Professor Edwards to respond to the Ram Trucks ad using King's words overlaid with images of war.
I work with Dr. King. He endorsed the Olympic Project for Human Rights, and I met with him a couple of times about that movement. When I saw that advertisement last night, I was appalled. I think that to reduce Dr. King's message, especially in this climate, in this country, under the circumstances that exist now, in terms of not just African American, but immigrant women's circumstances and so forth, to reduce Dr. King's message to a ploy to peddle trucks, I think is appalling. I think that to pimp Dr. King's message in that regard, in this day and age, under the circumstances that exist, given what we're up against as a people and where we look like we might be headed as a nation, is absolutely despicable. But as appalled as I am about the advertisers' use of it, I'm even more appalled that about the fact that somebody had to sign off on it. They didn't just go into a record store or go online and pick up Dr. King's speech and put it the voiceover on that advertisement without somebody associated with the King estate signing off on it. And I think that it's just appalling that Dr. King, his words, his wisdom, his critically important message at this time would be allowed to be pimped in that fashion in order to peddle goods.
Well, you know, Harry Edwards, I had the same feeling when I saw the ad. I'd say, because it's well known that the King family, Dr. King's children, are very protective of the use of his image and of his legacy. And interestingly, I heard on the radio this morning, one of the commercial radio stations, a member of the King family seeking to defend that ad and saying that it was really in the spirit of Dr. King's legacy. But it seemed to me, as you say, very crass to take a social justice leader and turn him into basically a pitchman for cars.
Well, it's not just that he was turned into a pitchman. It's that at a time when we should be studying Dr. King's message and studying his words in this critically important historical era, when we're on the verge of massive changes in virtually every institutional arena, to have watered down any aspect of his message to the point that it becomes an advertising ploy, I think degrades both the wisdom of the message and the urgency, what Dr. King referred to as the fierce urgency of now at one time. I think it waters down all of that. And to sign off on something like that, I think is despicable. There are people who are in control of his estate. They most certainly can do whatever they want to do, but in doing it, I think that they should also have to face the judgment of those people in society who regard Dr. King's words and wisdom as critically important and substantially enduring in terms of the struggles and so forth that we face as a society and as a nation.
That's Harry Edwards, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, author of a number of books, including The Revolt of the Black Athlete, reissued for its 50th anniversary edition. He is the architect of the 1968 Olympic Project for Human Rights. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Juan?
Well, we spend the rest of the hour with the author of a new book showing how the legacy of the civil rights movement in the United States has been distorted and whitewashed for public consumption. Professor and historian Jean Theoharis says iconic figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks have been rendered, quote, meek and dreamy, not angry, intrepid, and relentless. Theoharis writes, quote, racial injustice is America's original sin and deepest silence. The ways the country came to honor the civil rights movement were not simply about paying tribute to these courageous acts and individuals in the past, but also about sanctioning what will and will not be faced about the nation's history and present. The book is titled The More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History.
To talk more about the book, we are joined by the author, Jean Theoharis, professor of political science at Brooklyn College, has written extensively about the civil rights and Black Power movements, author of the award-winning book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. Jean Theoharis, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk first about the Ram ad, just what Dr. Edwards was talking about. Were you shocked when you saw it?
I mean, it's shocking, right? I mean, it's particularly shocking, as Dr. Edwards pointed out, when you actually see the speech, and certainly everyone this week should go back to the drum major speech and read it for yourselves, because King, in that very speech, is criticizing car commercials, and there it is. And
they're showing soldiers over his words.
Right. So the nationalistic, militaristic sort of subtext of the ad was also, I think, very disturbing, given what the drum major speech is about, given what Dr. King sort of is talking about both in that speech and that year, you know, repeatedly. Of course, Twitter sort of takes care of these things so beautifully. So I think there was nothing sort of more fun than then watching Twitter kind of explode with this. I think one of the things that I'm talking about in my book, though, is things that are harder to recognize, right? A bit harder to recognize, which are national recognitions, national celebrations of the civil rights movement, because those are both important and necessary and centering the history of the civil rights movement in the history of this country. So I'm thinking about sort of the honoring of Rosa Parks, both when she dies, her body is the first coffin of a woman, of a civilian, to lie in honor in the Capitol. There's a statue then placed in Statuary Hall of Rosa Parks, the first full-size statue of a Black woman there. These are epic honors, and yet how she gets honored, how the civil rights movement gets honored, right, is a form of kind of stripping and constraining, right? So she's constantly talked about only for that day on the bus. She's constantly talked about as quiet and not angry. And she's constantly talked about as a way to celebrate our progress. And that, I think, the national and nationalistic purposes that the civil rights movement now serves in our public square is sort of at the heart of what the book is talking about.
Well, let's talk about that anger and how that is whitewashed out. I mean, we just came from the Sundance Film Festival where a film was just premiered called King in the Wilderness, the last 3 years of King's life, when he is doubling down. He's becoming increasingly radicalized. He's organizing the Poor People's Campaign. He's speaking out against the war in Vietnam, which made this particularly this ad when you see the soldiers and you see war. I mean, he was risking everything, even the support of his inner circle when he gave that speech at Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967, a year to the day before he was killed against the Vietnam War. This came after that, the drum major speech.
And even earlier, I mean, I think as we sit here in New York City, right, to think about King's challenge to New York City, to Northern liberals, and that begins much earlier than I think we often recognize. In 1960, he's giving a speech here at the Urban League, and he's calling for a liberalism that's actually liberal here in the North and not just calling for change in the South. Right? He goes to L.A. in 1963, fresh out of the Birmingham jail. What's he talking about in L.A.? Not just Birmingham. He's talking about police brutality, school desegregation, housing segregation in L.A. This is 2 years before Watts. In 1964, he goes to Boston. He joins with kind of a burgeoning school desegregation movement in Boston. The Boston School Committee meets with him and basically shuts down the meeting, right? When King is talking about Northern injustice, even in the early 1960s, right? Northern liberals who are praising his actions in the South, right, shut it down when he starts to talk about sort of what's happening in the North. And actually, a couple months after the Watts Uprising, King writes a very important piece in the Saturday Review, basically taking the surprise around Watts to task and saying, for a long time, right, he'd been welcomed into the North. You know, he gets honors, he sits on these platforms, and yet when he turns to talking about what's happening there, only the language was polite, he says. The resistance was sort of firm and stubborn. So I think looking at what the more uncomfortable, right, the angry, the ways that Dr. King is calling out people in New York, not just people in Birmingham, right, that's a part of King that I think we need to sort of take seriously.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion with Professor Jean Theoharis, author of the book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with her in a moment.
Shot just because my heart lost the times I've been body and soul. I've been a victim of golden eyes. I see the dead walk among the living. In the vision was stripped away. It's made the same on the other side. Because I've seen the other side of power. Yeah, it's a game that can't go on. It's a breakdown.
The Underside of Power by Algiers. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we continue our conversation with historian Jean Theoharis, author of the new book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. Let's turn to a clip of President Ronald Reagan speaking November 2nd, 1983, when he signed the bill establishing the Martin Luther King National Holiday.
Now, our nation has decided to honor Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. by setting aside a day each year to remember him and the just cause he stood for. We've made historic strides since Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus. As a democratic people, we can take pride in the knowledge that we Americans recognized a grave injustice and took action to correct it.
So that is President Ronald Reagan in 1983, the official announcement of the holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King. That wasn't always President Reagan's view, Jean Theoharis.
Oh, no, no. Reagan, for many years, was very skeptical of a holiday for Martin Luther King. He thought there were too many holidays. It might be costly. He wasn't sure if King might be a communist or communist sympathizer. So for years, he'd opposed. Then he begins to see the political utility for him, particularly among moderate white voters. Reagan is has a sensitivity gap around racial issues, and he's running for re-election, and so he starts to see a political upside to backing this legislation. And I think in his speech, we see the elements of what is going to become what I'm calling the national fable of the civil rights movement, right? It's about courageous individuals in the past. They saw an injustice. The injustice is fixed, all herald the power of American democracy, right? So it's about progress. It's about American exceptionalism. It's about racism in the past. And that's going to be, in many ways, from Reagan to Bush to Clinton to Bush to Obama, to even President Trump, we see a kind of narrative of the civil rights movement that's about celebrating these individual heroes as a way to celebrate the greatness of America.
And as a way to put it into, as you say, into the past, because compare the way now that the mainstream narrative on the civil rights movement is to how Black Lives Matter is treated today.
Right. I mean, one of the motivations behind the book was the ways that this narrative of the civil rights movement is marshaled to kind of chastise and correct that Black Lives Matter. It's too extreme. It's, they might agree with the goals, but not the tactics. You're not going about it the right way. You're not, these aren't the right leaders. So many of these criticisms are criticisms that are waged against the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was seen as extreme. The civil rights movement was seen as going too far, too fast. Just to give you one poll, 1964 here in New York, we're not even talking about the South. This is a year before the Voting Rights Act. A majority of New Yorkers think the civil rights movement has gone too far by 1964 in New York.
Well, in 1966 was the Cicero March, where Martin Luther King went right into the heart of the North and marched in Cicero, Illinois, and said he'd never seen the kind of anger and violence from white people of Cicero like he'd seen in the South.
Absolutely. The last time Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King see each other is in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. He will describe it as the most disruptive indoor audience he ever encounters. He's called a traitor so many times that night that at one point he stops and says, we're going to have a Q&A and you can question me about my traitorness there, because he's just getting heckled the whole time. So I think that we have this idea that it was popular, that most decent people, supported it at the time, and regrettably, that was not the case.
So let's go to what you're saying about today. Last summer, in the wake of the police killings of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, Black Lives Matter activists in Atlanta, Georgia, took to the streets along with protesters around the country. This is Atlanta's then-mayor, Kasim Reed, reacting to the actions that shut down some of Atlanta's major arteries, the streets.
My message was that we're respecting their First Amendment rights, but we're the home of Dr. Martin Luther King. And the only thing that I ask is that they not take the freeways. That's everybody. That's your mom, my family, your families. And Dr. King would never take a freeway. I understand that this is just this generation's protest, but during the civil rights movement, they spent more time on making sure that everybody got home safe as they did in the actual protest itself. And so let's just let this be the best version of ourselves.
So Dr. King would never have taken a freeway, said Mayor Reed at the time. Professor Theoharis.
It's just hard to even know where to begin. I mean, probably the most iconic event, the Selma to Montgomery March. What is that? The Montgomery bus boycott, it's not taking a freeway, but it's absolutely disruptive. It's meant to be disruptive. It's meant to both disrupt the functioning of the bus company, but also, shortly after they began to boycott the buses, they also, that Christmas, boycott stores. It's meant to shut it's meant to say there can be no business as usual. And so part of, I think, the danger of these mishistories, the danger of this fable, is the ways then it's used to shut down sort of conversation and protest, in this constant wishing, Mike Huckabee saying, to Ferguson protesters, that he wished they would be more like MLK. And in my head, I'm thinking, be careful what you wish for, because they are, right? And you don't like it, right? It is disruptive. It is uncomfortable. It is relentless. It's not just injustice exposed as injustice changed. That's not how the civil rights movement actually proceeded. It was injustice exposed and exposed and exposed and exposed, and you move the needle slowly, 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 slowly.
And you talk also about the sort of the selective recollection of what the civil rights movement stood for. Clearly, with Dr. King, it was more about his insistence on equal rights than it was about his railing against income inequality or his attacks on militarism and the war. And you also, in your previous book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, talk about what's left out of the stories about Rosa Parks as well.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the ways that I've come to see the Montgomery bus boycott is as much about criminal justice as it is about bus segregation, because this is December 1955 when she makes her bus stand. In August of 1955, Emmett Till gets lynched. This case gets much more attention than many of the cases that Montgomery activists like Rosa Parks, because Rosa Parks had been active for more than a decade by this point, around cases like Emmett Till's. And with Emmett Till, they get enough attention to get an indictment. 4 days before she's going to make her bus stand, she goes to a huge mass meeting at King's Church, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, because the lead organizer in the Till case has come to town because the two men have just been acquitted. So they get an indictment, right?
And again, Emmett Till is a 14-year-old boy who went to the South for the summer. His mom, Mamie Till, sent him there to be out of Chicago, and he's lynched by a white mob.
He's lynched by two men, right, for making a comment to a white woman. And these two men, because of the attention to the case, actually are indicted and stand trial, but then they are acquitted. And so the organizer has come to Montgomery to tell people that they have to keep the faith and keep pushing on this. And Rosa Parks is there, Edie Nixon is there, King is there, they're all there. And the anger and the sadness, right, that this case, which seemed like the possibility to get justice, still no justice. And so I think we cannot understand what happens 4 days later, both why she makes her stand, she talks about thinking about Emmett Till, but also why Montgomery's community is in a breaking point at that point, and why we see a boycott sort of flower after that. And so I think that part of the story, right, that this is about criminal justice and segregation. Then her life continued, right? She's forced to leave Montgomery shortly after the Montgomery bus boycott. She'll spend more of her life in the North, in Detroit, fighting the racism of the Jim Crow North, right? She's an early opponent of the war in Vietnam. She's talking about, alongside many other Detroit activists, right, poverty, income inequality, segregation, urban renewal, police brutality. Rosa Parks will serve on a people's tribunal after the 1967 Detroit uprising because of the police brutality during the uprising and because of the police killings of 3 young men at the Algiers Motel. The police are not indicted for those murders. The newspapers aren't following the case. And so the people of Detroit, convene a people's tribunal to hold the cops accountable. Rosa Parks serves on the jury of that tribunal alongside an emerging Black Power movement. So her life, her political life, is far more expansive, I think, than the kind of one day on the bus.
The title of your book, Jean Theoharis, is A More Beautiful and Terrible History. Explain.
So the title is taken from James Baldwin's Talk to Teachers, where he says, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. And I chose this title because certainly reckoning with this history is more terrible. It is more sober. It is more uncomfortable. It asks things of us today. But it is also, I think, more beautiful, right? When you see what people did, when you see the power of kind of grassroots organizing, when you see how courageous the courage was, right, it's more beautiful. And I think it gives us much more for where we are today.
And the lesson about why there's such an attempt to sanitize this history and, in essence, clean it up for people to digest?
I mean, I think partly because it does offer so much. I talk in one of the chapters about the activism of high school students, right? From the high school student strike in Prince Edward County, led by 15-year-old Barbara Johns, that becomes one of the cases in Brown, to the walkouts in LA. Black and Chicano students walk out in LA in 1968 to protest conditions in school, to protest the sort of not enough Black and Latino history in school, to protest policing in school, to protest the lack of college classes in school. When you see that, right, many of these problems we face today, and you look at high school students, right, leading the way on that, right, and you see, and I think that gives us a much more fertile kind of starting point for where we go from here. But I think that's part of why, I mean, if we only see the leaders as adults, if we only see the leaders as having to be charismatic speakers, right? That doesn't leave a place at the table for most of us. And when you see that leaders came of all ages, right? Tweens to 80s, right? When you see it's men and women, when you see it's welfare recipients, public housing residents, church ladies, right? The whole gamut, right? There's a lot. I think there's a lot more to give us in terms of sort of where we struggle today.
You talk about how Black Lives Matter activists are compared unfavorably to civil rights leaders, and you talk specifically also about John Lewis, who started as a young man in that march from Selma to Montgomery. The first march over the bridge, King was not there, and he had his head bashed in.
Right, and I mean, I think one of the things that you see when you look at the civil rights movement is sort of groups like SNCC, right? Made up of young people.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Right. Some sort of adults in the community are welcoming this militancy. Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, right? But many adults are very scared, anxious, trepidatious about SNCC, about this young people organizing 50 and 60 years ago, right? So I think we also see the echoes of the kinds of criticisms, and many SNCC, former SNCC members put out a statement making the continuities between SNCC and Black Lives Matter clear, precisely because sort of many of the criticisms of Black Lives Matter were criticisms that they had faced 50 years ago.
Your criticisms of the King Memorial in Washington, D.C.?
A couple of things. If you've seen the King Memorial, he towers over us, right? He's sort of unapproachable. There are quotes all around. Not a single quote mentions racism, race, segregation. If you were to like come in from Mars and land, you would think he was sort of all about peace and love, right? And the kind of fundamental questions of race and racism and racial inequality, right, that he spoke about over and over and over, right? And a kind of pride, a Black pride, and that he speaks about over and over and over are sort of erased in that memorial. So both that he is this singular figure, right? The original plans had included sort of honoring many people, right? That he towers above us, but also that the quotes sort of are deracinated and they're stripped of their context. So it wouldn't have been hard to put under each quote sort of the context, right? That these come in movements, that they come at moments, but they're sort of hodgepodge, 1963, 1967, 1957. So we miss the kind of the power, and so many people visit it. And I just wish that we had a memorial that honored King the way he was.
Well, we will leave it there. Jean Theo Harris, a more beautiful and terrible history, the uses and misuses of civil rights history. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.